So Koresh swore it would never feed Dimensius again. Its people made oaths in the ruins, oaths written in glass sand and whispered through wrappings of light. And yet, in the deepest chamber of Manaforge Omega, a current hums towards the very being that shattered their world. Tonight, I'm following that current to see who built it, who guards it, and why an oathbreaker wears a crown. You see, Koresh is a scar looked at from orbit. A world once ruled by city-states and scholar priests, ringed with ecodomes and threaded with technomancy that could shape energy like cloth. And when Dimensius came, the air itself became a blade. Bodies failed. The people wrapped themselves in containment and called themselves ethereals. And out on the dunes, the wind still carries that first scream. The question that matters is whether it's about to start again. See, there's a forge humming at the planet's core adjacent vault. It isn't a blacksmith's anvil, think more refinery, sifting a desert's worth of broken mana into something a Void Lord can drink. And if that sounds impossible, it's because Koresh once specialized in making the impossible routine. Their craft was binding heat into glass, light into ribbon, souls into memory. The Shadow Guard learned it, they twisted it, and they set it to a single purpose: bringing Dimensius back. Though, here's what doesn't add up. The ethereal story we tell our children says that the greatest leaders fought Dimensius to a standstill on distant forges, tore up whole districts just to starve him. The name most often paired with that defiance is Salhadar. So why does the intake shaft of Omega whisper a different name for its master now? How does a high priest become a void apostate? How do you weave living silk from a beast and use it to tie a mind? Why does the forge need its energy pure, and what does that say about what Dimensius is allowed to be? Can a world be eaten twice? And what exactly are those demon hunters doing out on the glassed flats, circling the smell of the void like sharks? Let's begin at the intake, because that first door tells you everything the builders were afraid of. You see, the Plexus Sentinel stands in the forge like a judge. Its purpose is not subtle, it filters and it sterilizes. It scrubs the energy that flows through Omega until it meets a standard written by someone who fears contamination more than scarcity. You don't build a purifier like this unless the thing you are feeding is extremely picky or fragile. And that's the quiet truth. For all the terror attached to Dimensius, he needs a meal served just so. A Void Lord's appetite, but with rules. The Sentinel isn't a character so much as it is an ethic carved in metal. Koresh used to bind what was wild so life could go on in domes and sanctums. Here, that instinct is entirely inverted. Everything unbound must be purged before the current continues. Even the planet's pain is an impurity that must be filtered out. So the first answer to these questions is the Forge isn't a floodgate, it's more of a colander. Dimensius doesn't just want power, he wants prepared power, and the Shadow Guard, well, they're his cooks. And now I'm sure you'll agree that machinery can be sullen and faithful, it obeys. But the next chambers, they're living. They breed obedience of a different kind. Lumathar, he's not a myth, it's a harvest. It exists because someone on Koresh remembered what Reshi artisans once did with ribbon and cloth. How they could lay energy across a lattice and teach it to hold a shape, and asked, well, the cruelest question: what if those lattices were alive? Lumathar spins a silk that resonates with mind, thin as breath and clingy as guilt. The Shadow Guard call it living silk. You don't need to understand the weave to understand its intent. Take silk that responds to will, soak it in a soul pulled from the twisting nether, stretch it until it remembers the outline you chose for it. This is where Nazandri walks in, hands clean, voice entirely soft. Soulbinder is a title old as temples and new as the vault. Her work is to coax out of the nether where the dead drift those who once wore the wrappings of Koresh, She binds them in Lumithar's silk. She gives each a task chosen by the Shadow Guard's doctrine. And if you want to know what philosophy she serves, it isn't random cruelty. It's the belief that a people's afterlife is just one more resource to be managed. You see, if you look at early debates before the Sundering, the oracles argued about whether vision should guide craft or craft should discipline vision. Nazandri's answer is simple: neither, only function. You see, Shadow Guard function is multiplication. Do you need a guard who never sleeps? A courier who never loses the path? A killer who doesn't falter at the smell of old names? Then bind them, silence the part that remembers deserts and domes, throw it in a purpose that doesn't end. There's a horror here that isn't screaming, it's more administrative. If Lumathar is a loom, Nazandri is a civil servant with a key to the afterlife vault. She signs forms, but the ink is souls. So the second answer, that the Shadow Guard's ranks aren't merely recruited, they're manufactured from the unquiet dead of Koresh, bound in silk that listens. However, out on the surface, the dunes are glass that cuts light into ribbons. If you've ever seen a desert after lightning walks across it, you know that colour. That's Fractilus's cradle. It was never meant to be a person. Reality was bent, and it just didn't, snap back cleanly. Fractilus patrols the waste like a memory of impact. It picks up the glass sand and makes it teeth. And what's important about it isn't tactics, it's testimony. The land itself is still trying to say what happened. Pressure, heat, a vector from outside. Those who walk the wastes, they learn quickly that Koresh isn't just a setting for a story, it's a witness who interrupts. You can't talk about reforging a Void Lord without the ground under you rejecting the premise. But not everything that hunts in those flats is an elemental conscious. Adorus Duskblaze learned what happens when hunger meets, the wrong kind of power. If demon hunters make oaths to master their own appetite by turning it against worse things, Adorus's mistake was thinking the void could be disciplined the same way the fell can be. It doesn't bargain, it repaints. He is joined by Alyssa Darksorrow and Velarin Bloodwrath, mirrors of discipline held up to his tremor. The three of them, they're not Shadow Guard, they're drawn by the same beacon that Omega sends down the fault lines. There's meat here and there's a feast, and hunters, they become the carrion when the feast is looking back. So you see, the third answer, the demon hunters are not allies or architects, they're moths to a lantern that harms whatever it lights. If we're simply counting guardians, the story would feel procedural. A sentinel, a beast, a binder, a weaver, a trio under a sixth sun, and of course an elemental. It would all be gloomy architecture, but the Shadow Guard aren't a machine cult because they like valves and metal things. They're a memory cult. There is a face at the end of this hall with a name that used to be only spoken in prayer. Salhadar. Before the Sundering, he was High Priest among those who believed that Koresh could harmonise vision and craft, the dreams of the world soul with the careful work of the architects and the oracles. You see, after the Sundering, his name travelled with stories about resistance. Way back in Neverstorm, where a different Manaforge tried to pull the same trick with a different slice of the void, those stories say Salhadar died fighting. You can carve an entire saga out of a rumour like that, and of course, some did. Omega does not honour that funeral. It introduces a different Salhadar, not a new one, a revealed one. The man who wore the headdress of the Untamed turned out to be the one who made the pact. And you can react to that in several ways. You can call him resurrected, call him replaced, call him a mask peeled off. The truth that doesn't require any of those guesses is simpler and, worse. At some point, whether before the desert took him or after he stepped back out of it, Salhadar aligned himself with the being that broke his world. He commands Voidwings from a dock etched in shadow. He signs Nazandri's orders. He dines with Araz in the central operations and tells him how fast to feed. You see, he is the one Nexus Kings are now measured against. A man whose title used to imply stewardship of connections is now cut to one connection only: devotion. And this right here, this changes every line that came before. Nizandri Silk is not a faceless bureaucracy, it's the policy arm of a crown. Araz's meters aren't neutral, they enforce a theology. The purifier way back at the entrance is not a prudent engineer's compromise, it's a ritual cleanliness for a god. There's a reason the Shadow Guard call the dock where Salhadar stands the Shadow Docks. Not because of the lighting, though it is kinda dark. Because this is where they replace the old Koresh calendar with a new one. Year 0, the day they feed the Devourer. Every storage tally in Omega is a liturgy of numbers aimed at that soul sunrise. And Araz, he's the priest of that sunrise. When you walk into Central Operations, the math is singing. Streams of refined power root around you, braided and bound and tensed like bowstrings drawn all the way back, but not released. You see, they hum towards a living target, a heart that used to be dark. The dark heart is not a metaphor the Shadow Guard invented for poetry, it is the chosen vessel for a sacrament. It turns Koresh's suffering into fuel and carries it right towards the seat of the Devourer. And why the seat, you ask? Because a ruler sits, a ruler presides, and the last thing the Shadow Guard want is another chase across Manaforges in distant wastes. They want to give Dimensius a throne today and never make him walk. So the fourth answer, the Forge, is not an assembly line towards a weapon, it's an altar line towards a coronation. You see, it's helpful to remember that this is the same exact story that played out in places with different skies. Out in Outland's purple storms way back when, there was a Manaforge called Ultras that tried to mouth the void and bit off more than it could hold. Yes, it opened a door, but the thing on the other side, well, that thing on the other side did not ask permission to come in. People that had worn the same wrappings that now haunt Nizandri's vault, they went out to hold that threshold closed, and they paid for it. That attempt to choke Dimensius was never a forever answer. It was a slowed heartbeat, but here in Omega, the Shadow Guard's whole argument is to restart it. Here, if you take one walk outside Omega before you descend to the sea, go to Tazavesh. Once a market that set its table under different constellations, it's now planted on Koresh as a civic promise. The Koresh Trust is a coalition of brokers and ethereals. They're trying to solve a problem that no one's written a manual for: how to turn a salvage operation into a home. They're not fanatics, they don't bind the dead, they stand at the city's edge and teach people how to sleep again. The fact that a city like that is standing here now tells you this surface is more than just a set of ruins, it's a vote. But votes are quiet, they don't stop rituals on their own. That's what the seat's for. If a Void Lord is waking, he wakes slowly, and you can hear it in structures that weren't built for sound. The seat of the Devourer is a listening place. The walls learn your fear and then they repeat it back to you. When Dimensius manifests, it isn't a shape you can catalogue, it's an instruction. The Shadow Guard try to fulfill it with the only materials they trust: refined power and the certainty that they have chosen the winning side. Here's where the earlier question about purity becomes more than just a technical note. A being like Dimensius does not want the flavour of Koresh as it is. He wants Koresh as it was when he broke it. Pliable, without resistance, every knot loosened. That's why the Sentinel purges, that's why Araz meters, that's why Nizandri seals lips, and that's why Fractillus must be treated as a mistake instead of a verdict. And of course, that's why Salhadar stands on a dock that refuses to name the moon. You see, if you've ever watched glass slump in a kiln, you know the way it stops fighting when the heat is just right. That's what a second devouring would look like. Not a second impact, more of a surrender. The fabric of the world learns the temperature it was forced to hold and then just settles. The people bound in silk do not protest, they tighten. The hunters outside, they become ornaments. The city light dims just enough to be polite. And somewhere in the sea, something that calls itself all devouring crosses out the hyphen and lets the title just be a sentence. That right there, that is the shape of what's at stake. Reality is not lost in a flash, it's misfiled under a new category and just never looked up again. But you see, there is one contradiction. How does Salhadar rationalize this crown? You don't need a villain's monologue, the answer is already woven through the chains below him. First, well, control. If Dimensius is inevitable, then choose to be his steward. Say you are protecting your people by negotiating with power that can't be refused or beaten. Second, memory. If Koresh's past greatness was in binding, bind the unbindable. Prove that the old craft still rules what it touches. And third, of course, faith. If your people were led by oracles, argue that you've seen a vision truer than their caution, that salvation looks like obedience. None of these reasons are new. These are the oldest justifications we have for crowns that, well, shouldn't exist. But the only person on Koresh who has all three in a voice that carries, a former high priest who learned how to count and never forgot being listened to. You see, the oath never again becomes, well, only this way. The covenant protect the living, that now becomes repurpose the dead. And the dream bind chaos into culture, well, that becomes bind culture into chaos. Salhadar does not need to be a lich or a phantom to be a reversal. He only needs to call the same words from a different place on the map. That's why every Guardian in Omega is about the same lesson. Obedience, purify, produce, bind, meter, patrol, feed. Only one of them is allowed to want anything, and even he is not allowed to want it in the wrong form. You see, the thing about wanting though is it leaks. There are still people on Koresh who want something that doesn't sound like a meter. In the campaign to push back this ritual, Illyria Windrunner she's not an outsider invited to just point at the problem and leave. She's part of a line of argument that begins when Locust Walker taught someone to survive the sound the void makes when it's practiced in a room. He learned that on Koresh's old texts. He learned it from people who used to sign their names with light itself. The opposition to Dimensius isn't imported, it's reading itself. So the fifth answer, the crown is justified by control, memory and faith, each corrupted from Koresh's own virtues. So we've closed the purity rule, we understand the silk question and the hunter's presence, and we understand the alter shape of the forge. We've closed the betrayal's motive, but one question it still remains. Can a world be eaten twice? And the nice thing is that Koresh answers that one for me. It says adamantly, no. Not because it can't happen, but because it refuses to let that be the story. The ecodomes are not nostalgic set dressing, they're laboratories for stubbornness. Tazavesh is not just a curiosity, it's an election in favour of survival. Yes, Fractillus is an angry verdict, but anger is a kind of life, and it moves. Even the dead bound in Nazandri's silk know how to pull. One thread out of place is, well, that's the beginning of an unravelling. The thing to remember is that the current humming towards Dimensius is not a destiny, it's more of a plan, and plans break. You see, here's where this plan breaks. The purifier that tried to make Koresh acceptable to a devourer is overwhelmed by a different refusal, the world's refusal to be pure enough to eat. And the meters that try to make the current polite, they're yanked from their housing when the city refuses to dim. That silk that tried to keep the dead industrious, it begins to slack because the living remember their names. And the crown that told a people we will survive by bowing, is met by a louder sentence, a chanting, a screaming, and it's the one that Koresh wrote in glass the day the sky fell. Never again. You see, Dimensius wakes into the wrong meal, and well, he's going to find out that it's full of grit.